Good evening and thanks for being here, everyone. Thanks in particular to Sehmat, to Sidhu for inviting me, and thanks for Keval for the introduction. It's an incredible honor, even if largely undeserved. I'm a little relieved, though, with the introduction when Sudhanva said that isse pehle 19 the. So there were 19 eminent people before this, so thankfully after the 19 there are no more eminent people, so that's a bit of a relief. I was also a little I expressed my initial kind of hesitation at accepting, this invitation, primarily for the fact that apart from being involved in the back end of a few disastrous plays, I didn't have much to do with theater at all. And one of those disasters involved, and a point when I was reading Marx's Volume 1, and we wanted to do political theater. So we did a play in which we thought we should highlight commodity fetishism. So we decided that we won't put the lights on any of the actors. Sirf commodities pe dalenge. As this entire kind of, alienation, etc. The play went on a little, kind of average kind of play, but at the end of it, the judge, when asked for his comments, said, everything was great, but the lighting was done by which idiot here? So, but after my initial reservation, it kind of quickly converted to excitement, and as the preparation for this talk led me to conversations, to new literature, and to also performances, which have allowed me to think a little differently about questions of law and justice. So in that sense, thanks for allowing me to stray ahead of myself. I'm also a little awed by the list of eminent people who have delivered this lecture in the past, of whom I have to mention G.P. Deshpande, or GPD, who passed away exactly a month ago. So in a way, today is an opportunity for us to pay a double tribute to GPD and to Safdar. Both their lives and work have left a lasting legacy for how we think about questions of art, activism, and politics. And I hope I'm able to do justice to their memory. But here we are immediately faced with an irony. Because for most of my talk today, I'm going to address the question of this idea of justice being the experience of the impossible. So almost forecasting, in a way, the impossibility of my living up to the tradition. But if I think about the idea of a memorial lecture, it immediately opens up for me the various ways of thinking about the idea of a memorial itself, of which this lecture is one. But it really is the work of Janam and Sehmat, and the sustained interventions in India's kind of political and cultural landscape for the last 2 decades, which are the obvious legacies of Safdar. But the legacy that I want to begin with is the one that I think we ignore very often, and that's the Safdar Hashmi Marg. Sandwiched between a Sikandar Road and a Tansen Marg, the Safdar Hashmi Marg sits uncomfortably between the familiar markers of national memory and cultural memory, bearing testimony to a horrible act of violence and to the fact that a performance had been interrupted 24 years ago, and the body of a performer had been felled less than 25 kilometers away from the Safdar Hashmi Marg itself. It was, of course, a performance that in turn, as much of Janam's street theater does, created a radical interruption with its insistence on a halla bol. And it's these forms of interruption by art and performance and the aftershocks that they create that I want to look at today. An image that appears to disrupt how and what we see. A scream that shatters an unjust silence, or a performance that claims a sovereign moral force on our imagination and sensibilities. All of these constitute an ethos of interruption which, following Jacques Rancière, reminds us of the fact that politics has always been aesthetic, and the political is constituted by interruptions in the distribution of the sensible. In that sense, the very presence of a Safdar Hashmi Marg is itself an interruption, which disrupts the usual flow of traffic and memory in the city. It inserts itself as a scandal in the heart of the city, a scandal that is repeated every time Janam or Sehmat reclaims public space and memory. It is therefore less a marg or a path that allows easy passage, and more an obstacle that denies any easy passage. The Greek word eporos, literally meaning without passage or not allowing passage, mutates into the word aporia, or an impasse. And I will return repeatedly today to the idea of the aporia and its relation to questions of justice. And the question that I'm interested in exploring is, how does theater interrupt the passage from law to justice? And what may it mean to think of the reconstitution of justice via the ethics and aesthetics of a performance? But before I get into that, allow me a small detour into the relationship between legal and theatrical form. Agnes Varda, the filmmaker, once said of the relationship between cinema and photography that they were like a brother and sister who are enemies after incest. One could say the same of the relationship between theater and legal process. On the one hand, you have the theatricality of the courtroom, which is often cited as an example of the inherent dramatic structure, for example, of the trial, with its emphasis on competing narratives, the paraphernalia of gowns, the gravitas of the gravel, and the architectural logic of the courtroom. On the other side, you have the appropriation of the form of the trial and judgment in many forms of theater, which raise questions of how we think of these two theaters of justice and the kindred as well as agonistic relationship that they share. One of the most dramatic trials in the 20th century was that of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem after he had been captured by Mossad from Argentina, where he was after World War II. The trial was staged as a public event to provide the world a pedagogy in suffering and justice. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial for The New Yorker at that point of time, alerted us immediately to the theatricality of the setting of this trial. And she says, Bet Hamispat, the house of justice. These words, shouted by the court usher at the top of his voice, make us jump to our feet as they announce the arrival of the three judges. The proceedings happen on a stage before an audience, with the usher's marvelous shout at the beginning of each session producing the effect of the rising curtain. Whoever planned this auditorium in the newly built Beth Ham, the House of the People, had a theater in mind, complete with orchestra and gallery, with proscenium and stage, and with side doors for the actor's entrance. So this kind of, form, in a way, that they share has always been an umbilical one. But if the legal system has always closely been modeled on theater, then theater has also been very adept at adopting and appropriating the idea of the trial to redefine the possibilities of theater. Jasko Horstmann, in his book Theaters of Justice, says that Bertolt Brecht was obsessed with the trial as a mode and a model of radicalizing conventional theater, since it forced the audience to pass judgment and prevented them from succumbing too easily to the temptations of empathy. As we all know, at the heart of Antigone, again, is an unclaimed body and an act of interruption. Antigone stands as a haunting presence constantly hovering over formal legal systems and inserting through her death a scandal. A scandal at the heart of the Western legal system, one that inaugurates the conflict between law and normativity at its very start by splitting ethics at its very origins. Judith Butler, in her reading of the play, says that Antigone inaugurates a law of her own, the law of the singular, which is simultaneously a non-law, since it has only one instance of application, her brother Polynices. But it is precisely this law of the singular which prevents any easy passage, generating the aporia at the heart of law and justice. In Antigone, Creon says, only while our city voyages through on course can we establish friendships truer than blood itself. But Antigone's stubborn desire for the impossible and her insistence on doing justice to Polynices refuses to allow the city to voyage true on course and creates an aporia between the singular and the universal. For the legal scholar Kostas Douzinas, the force of Antigone's demand to bury her irreplaceable brother renders the law unenforceable. But yet her act is not merely one that violates the law, but on the contrary, the ground upon which all law arises. If the law is grounded on the legitimate sanction of force, the ultimate display of which is, of course, the exercise of the power of death over life, then Antigone's embrace of death exceeds the ability of law to enforce death. The law, in striving to the universal, necessarily converts the particular and the singular into the general, and has to bury Antigone, even as her burial ground renders the law bereft of any force. This idea of the force of the law becomes the basis for one of the most interesting articles from Derrida. In what is often seen as post-structuralism's turn to ethics, Derrida's essay, The Force of Law, The Mystical Foundations of Authority, a title which the title of my talk also alludes to, inaugurated a very important debate on the relationship between deconstruction and justice. He was keenly interested in the moment of how and when the law loses its moral force and becomes unenforceable, and what possibilities this opens up for for the thinking of justice. And there are two key themes in his essay that concerns us. The first one is the idea of the mystical foundation. Derrida borrows the idea of the mystical foundation from Montaigne's reflections on the authority of law. And according to Montaigne, and so laws keep up their good standing not because they are just, but because they are laws. That is the mystical foundation of their authority. They have no other. Anyone who obeys them because they are just is not obeying them the way he ought to be. In India, one could say of the Supreme Court that the Supreme Court is supreme not because it is infallible because it is supreme. And that's its mystical foundations. It is mystical because even as the law constantly evokes the idea of justice to sustain itself, for it to be law, it has to undo justice by converting the singular into the general. And this leads us to the second theme that Derrida talks about, namely that of the aporia, the non-passage. The conversion by law of the singular to the universal happens through the principle of recognition, exemplified in case law, or the application of a legal principle and precedents to the facts of a case. There are times, however, as we've seen with Antigone, when such a passage is denied, and this is its aporia. When the singular claims of justice exceed the law, we arrive at this undecidable and the impossible. While law resides primarily within the domain of the calculable, justice is incalculable, and hence always the experience of the impossible. So what do we do about this impasse, and what are we to make of it? Are we perpetually doomed to being stuck in this aporia of justice? In a conversation that I had with Shabri Rao, a dancer and theater performer for this talk, she made a claim that there is never a performance which is a repetition, at least not a performance with any integrity. And every performance is therefore an improvisation which is acutely aware of the presence of the performer, the audience, and the present moment that they share. And therein lies its aesthetic and ethical power. To my mind, her statement brings in two dimensions, which allows us a way of thinking what theater and performance may have to say to the aporia of justice. On the one hand, the question of time and presence, and on the other, improvisation. So let me turn first to the question of improvisation before moving to the vexed question of presence. In a spectacular move, already spectacular by the fact that she is simultaneously a legal scholar and a jazz scholar, Sarah Ramshaw brings together her two interests to offer us a fascinating take on how the imagination of justice and judgment may benefit greatly from an engagement with improvisation in jazz performances. She reads Derrida's Force of Law essay alongside the history of jazz to develop an idea of the law of the extempore and justice as improvisation. Toni Morrison famously said of jazz, "It was the music. It made you do unwise, disorderly things. Just hearing it was like violating the law." So what is it about jazz that inspires such a wild and transgressive link? It appears as if there's something inherently transgressive about jazz, both in terms of its social history, but also its penchant for improvisation and its tendency to violate the rules and the laws of music. Sarah Ramshaw says that this popular conception of jazz doesn't actually provide us with an accurate sense of the immanent logic of improvisation within jazz. She begins by clearing many of the misconceptions that people have had about jazz by arguing that improvisation is far from the extempore event that it's often deemed to be. To appreciate the extempore nature of improvisation, it must instead be captured within a system of conventions that constantly restrains it. The improvised act for her can only be analyzed or understood through pre-existing or prevailing laws of language and music. It can never be completely beyond or outside the law of music, of the musical text, and exists only in relation to an original melody, theme, or musical tradition. To do so otherwise would make recognizing it as improvisation impossible. Equally, if improvisation was completely determined by the prevailing musical laws or traditions, then it would cease to be improvisation and would instead become predictable, calculable, and programmable, much like the law. Linking the relationship between improvisation and tradition, she argues that it is akin to the undecidable relationship between singularity and generality. On the one hand, the singularity of the improvised act must be an inaugural event, a first time ever. And yet, if this first time ever is absolutely unique, then it's also the last time, and that would erase the possibility of it being recognized as improvisation. It is in its iterability through repetition and alteration which makes the originality of improvisation possible in the first place. Let me turn to her writing about the ethics of improvisation in jazz, but I would argue more generally in performances. She says, it is the ethical responsibility for the other which lies at the heart of creativity. Why? Because the nature of improvisation inherently arises from an attitude of openness as well as obligation. To be open to change in music also entails an obligation or responsibility to what comes before and what comes after improvisation. Improvisation in jazz or theater is then directed towards an undoing of closed structures in order to make possible the coming of the other. Surrounded by laws, improvisation dares to defy codes, while it simultaneously runs the risk of becoming fully codified. It involves, in other words, the permanent play of the threshold and transgression and an attempt to risk the unknown. Now, contrary to the legal dogmatism that sees the role of law as repetition without difference, or conservatives who stick to the idea of a strict original intention of framers of law, what we have emerging is an image of the law which is about inherent improvisation.